I want to first thank Richard Bennett. I'm told you're the man who put all this together. So thanks, what a job. And I want to thank Colin Mangrum, my friend Colin, who inspired me to do this, talked me into doing it. And by the way, Colin, in front of all these witnesses, I want to state I will come visit you in prison. This is a history symposium to celebrate the Mormon exodus across Iowa, the 175th anniversary. It's also the 175th anniversary of the state of Iowa being granted statehood. So Iowa history is kind of tied up in this. And my topic is freedom of speech, and I will get to that. But first, a digression. I want to talk about two Iowa Supreme Court cases that have recently come to my attention, and I find them astonishing. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in 1868, and it, of course, has the famous Equal Protection Clause, the clause that was used in, for example, Brown versus Board of Education to outlaw racial segregation in public schools. Just a few months before the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the Iowa Supreme Court handed down a decision that upheld the right of African American children to enroll in white-only schools. 12-year-old Susan B. Clark applied for admission to the public school in Muscatine, Iowa, and she was denied admission because of her race. So she sued. Her father sued on her behalf, and the Iowa Supreme Court said the white-only public school in Muscatine had to admit her. And here's how their opinion began. They stated the principle of equal rights to all, upon which our government is founded. Then they used the slippery slope argument that Colin talked about, the one that's killed the free exercise clause, but here, personally, I love the way they used it. They said, if the school has the power to exclude African children, then they have the power to exclude the children of the Irish or the Germans. And they have the power to segregate Protestants and Catholics into separate schools. And if the state can mandate separate schools for Africans, they could mandate separate schools for poorly clad children so that they do not intermingle with the better clothed children. This was 96 years before the Supreme Court, didn't say the same, but came to the same conclusion regarding racial discrimination in public schools. And then 5 years after that first opinion, there was a case where an African-American woman, she was 1/4 African ancestry, she bought a ticket on a steamboat on the Mississippi River. And she was able to buy the ticket, she was able to travel on the steamboat down the Mississippi, but she wasn't allowed to have a stateroom. She had to sleep on a cot out on the deck of the boat, and she wasn't allowed to eat in the dining room. She had to eat out on the deck of the boat. So she filed a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court of Iowa upheld her right to equal treatment. And they cited the 14th Amendment, which was pretty much brand new back then, to the United States Constitution, and then they quoted Article 1, Section 1 of the Iowa Constitution, the very first provision. And I'll quote the court. The principle of equality is announced and secured by the very first words of our state constitution, namely, quote, all men are by nature free and equal, close. Upon it, we rest our conclusion in this case. So, if you'll forgive the digression, freedom of speech. I've been thinking a lot lately about offensive speech and government attempts to regulate offensive speech. and to regulate it just because it offends. And I've been thinking a lot about it lately, partly because there's so much incivility, there's so much speech on television and the internet and so forth that I find offensive. And a lot of my friends, liberal friends and conservative friends, have come up to me citing different things that are being said and say, you know, how can we stop this? And I tell them, well, you're offended by it, but government can't stop it just because you're offended by it, or I'm offended by it, or hundreds of us, thousands of us, or millions of us are offended by it. And so that's what I want to talk about. And what I want to give you is 9 reasons why the First Amendment protects offensive speech. The first reason is that's the only speech that needs protection. Nobody tries to suppress speech that doesn't offend somebody. So you don't need to protect any speech really that doesn't cause somebody offense. Take, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church. It was founded by a Baptist minister, the Reverend Fred Phelps. It has 40 or so members, and almost every one of them is a member of his extended family. They all live in a compound in Topeka, Kansas, and they protest at the funerals of American servicemen and women. And in that protest, they hold up picket signs that say things like this: God hates the USA. By the way, here's the reason God hates the USA: because the United States is tolerant of homosexuality. So God hates the USA. God hates fags. God killed your son or daughter because the United States is tolerant of homosexuality. Thank God for dead soldiers, and on and on. And it's outside the funeral of the soldier. Somebody's holding up a sign saying, your son is burning in hell. Well, that's offensive. Not long ago, Fred's died now, but not long ago, his daughter, Shirley Phelps Roper, was arrested in Sarpy County, Nebraska, right across the river. They were protesting at the funeral of a dead soldier killed in action. And they were holding up their signs, but Shirley Phelps Roper was wearing a flag skirt, and her 10-year-old son was standing on an American flag. So Shirley was arrested, charged with a number of crimes, and the courts, the federal courts in Nebraska, overturned her conviction. Is her speech offensive? Well, yes, it's in so many ways, I can't list them. But the views that family is expressing, they are their own deeply held religious and political, I guess, also views. And they're views that are shared. There are not many people who spread these views in such a hurtful way, but they're views that are shared by many people. So what is government? Who is government to tell them that they cannot express their views in a way that's going to get them maximum exposure? I'm from Missouri, and Missouri has a history of great senators. Harry Truman was a senator in Missouri before he resigned to become the Vice President of the United States. We had Jack Danforth, we had Stuart Symington. Oh, and an obscure Iowa connection. The very first senator from Missouri was Thomas Hart Benton. Now, it wasn't the painter, but it was Thomas Hart Benton. And he was the great uncle of the famous Iowa painter, Thomas Hart Benton. But now we have Josh Hawley. Conduct is speech if the actor intends to send a message and if the audience will receive a message. So Josh Hawley's speech was January 6th, walking by the mob outside of the Capitol. He walked by, he looked at them, and he raised his fist. That offended me, perhaps particularly because I'm from Missouri. And we have Marjorie Taylor Greene. She said the attack on the Pentagon was fake. She said COVID-19 is not dangerous for people who are not obese and not dangerous for people who are obese and who are not over 65 years of age. And she said vaccines don't work. I find that talk offensive. And here's one more thing that offends me. I find it offensive when government tries to stop speech for the sole reason that it is offensive. Whether one person is offended by it, whether many people are offended by it, whether the majority is offended by it, I'm not talking about private actors. I'm talking about the power of the state. The power of the state is of a whole different magnitude. So here are 9 reasons. And the first reason I have already told you about: offensive speech is the only kind that needs protection. Polite, polished, flattering speech doesn't fear suppression. The very speech that needs protection is crude and offensive speech. The second is the problem of decision. Take the Westboro Baptist Church. God hates fags. God hates the USA. Your son is burning in hell. Wearing the flag skirt, standing on the American flag. This is an expression. Any sign that begins God hates offends me. But this is an expression of their most deeply held religious and political views. The majority may find them wrong. The majority may find what they're saying valueless. The majority may find their ideas false. But to them, they are true. And like it or not, they are inspired by those ideas. Referencing something Colin talked about, they are inspired by their religion to hold those views. And they want to spread their message with muscle. They are freely exercising their religion. And by the way, Colin's right, the free exercise clause, the jurisprudence under that clause is a mess. But some of the cases that might be decided under the free exercise clause have been these days decided under the free speech clause. So it's the majority opinion, let's just take that for granted, that holding up those kinds of signs is a bad idea. If the majority, but we can't let them, here's another example. In the 1950s in Connecticut, there was a statute, state statute, that said that contraceptive devices cannot be used. But moving on to the topic here, it also said that it made it a crime for a doctor to discuss with his or her patients contraception. And that was the majority view enacted into law in the state of Connecticut. Historically, majorities in many states believed in and protected by law the right to own slaves, to enslave a race of people, and government stifled the speech of abolitionists. It found them to be traitors and tried to shut them up. This is the second problem with criminalizing speech just because it offends. Who gets to decide what we can say? Who gets to decide what we can hear? Who gets to decide what we can read? Well, in my opinion, it certainly shouldn't be the government. Under our Bill of Rights, free speech is not a majority decision. It's a constitutional decision. Third is the problem of unequal abilities. Abraham Lincoln was an eloquent speaker. Mark Twain could make a point with incredible irony. Lyndon Johnson was in a position of power, and he could effect great change from his position of power. Most of us can't do that. We don't have the eloquence of Lincoln, the irony of Mark Twain. We don't have the subtlety of the great poets. We don't have the intelligence of someone like, say, Stephen Hawking or Colin Mangrum. Most of us, take Gregory Lee Johnson. In opposition to the war in Vietnam, he burned a flag. It got to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they overturned his conviction for burning the flag. Now, he wasn't tried for violating an open fire law. He wasn't tried for stealing a flag. Those things you can do. He was tried just for lighting it on fire to express his opposition to the war in Vietnam. That's the best he could do. Eloquence, irony, power, subtlety, those things were not in his wheelhouse. I think of the man who at a public forum on health care was reduced to standing up and screaming, "Don't let the government get its hands on my Medicare." Coming in at number 4, the problem of unequal application. Take the American flag. Gregory Lee Johnson burned the American flag. Barbara Bush wore a flag scarf. Shirley Phelps Roper wore a flag skirt. Which one got arrested? Barbara Bush or Shirley Phelps Roper? Which one got arrested for her wardrobe choice? Some persons respect the flag because they support government policies. Other persons show disrespect in protest. I've been to cocktail parties where they had those little barbecued wieners with toothpicks stuck in them and an American flag on the toothpick. And that flag gets dropped on the floor, it gets stepped on, it gets thrown in the trash, and it gets thrown out with the garbage. Gregory Lee Johnson, he burned a flag. He disrespected it. Who gets arrested? The host of the cocktail party or Gregory Lee Johnson? And this is the problem of unequal application. And when Gregory Lee Johnson's case got to the Supreme Court of the United States, that court upheld his right to burn the flag, and the opinion was written by Justice Scalia. And a main focus of his opinion was this problem of unequal application. Fifth, number 5 on my list is the problem of the disenfranchised. Laws forbidding offensive speech commonly fall on the disenfranchised, those without power, those without money. Offensive speech laws are consistently applied against a certain class of society. And that kind of censorship kills the voice of the disenfranchised. Government generally is going to go after those who are marginalized. The men and women who have no wealth, the men and women who have no power, no friends in high places, but who criticize those in high places. Government is going to go after Shirley Phelps Roper and not Barbara Bush. Now, I know the context in which Barbara Bush wore the flag scarf and the context in which Shirley Phelps Roper wore the flag skirt is much different. But the principle, I think, is not different, and Justice Scalia pretty much agreed. The problem of definition is number 6. I'm offended by those who disparage military service. I'm offended by those who use the N-word. I'm offended by sentences that start with the 2 words, God hates. I hate Obama. I'm quoting a sermon by a pastor from Arizona. He explained why he hates Obama. God hates Obama. I hate Obama. I hate him. God wants me to hate Barack Obama. This speech offends me greatly, but he will not be arrested for this. Shirley Phelps Roper, the other hater, will be. Burning a flag does not seriously offend me when it's a means of protest, but the burning of a cross in the yard of an African American or the painting of a swastika on a synagogue does offend me. I'm seriously offended by comparisons to Hitler. George Bush was compared to Hitler. George Bush is seriously not Hitler. Trump, not Hitler. Biden, Obama, not Hitler. I've heard Biden's policies referred to as compared to Hitler's. Comparisons to Hitler degrade the Holocaust and upgrade Hitler, and it really offends me. But who defines which of these words, which of this speech cannot be spoken? Are we going to pass a law against the F word or the N word or Hitler comparisons or, well, I could go on, but Professor Mangrum has limited my time. Richard Nixon was offended by modern art and the Kennedys. Whose definition do we apply? Most people today, it seems to me, define offensive speech as speech with which they disagree. Disagreement is not enough to bring down the power of the wrath of government, federal, state, or local. We each want to be allowed to make our own decision. We each want to be allowed to express our own religion without fear of imprisonment, and in so many other countries, torture and death. The problem of uncertainty is next on my list. When Marjorie Taylor Greene says vaccines do not work, we could say, well, that's self-evidently false. We can say that it's settled science that they do work. They're not perfect, no vaccine is, but they work. But remember, back in the day, it was settled science, observational science, that the sun revolved around the earth. All you had to do was look up. Comes up in the east, goes across the sky, and goes down in the west. You'd be a fool not to believe it. And Galileo was punished for saying that the earth revolved around the sun. Quoting one of my favorite songs, Galileo's crime was looking up the truth. I was driving home from my office. I now have an office at a law firm in Omaha. I was driving home from my office one day, and I put the radio on AM, and I punched the button, and it went station to station, and it landed on KFAB, which if you're from around here, you probably know what that is. If you're not, it's a high-powered, very powerful signal station in Omaha, and it's, they call it talk radio, they call it news radio, but it's really more talk radio. They have a drive time host who is against vaccinations and mask wearing. And so I stopped to listen to what he had to say, and he took a call. And this woman said, I know the topic today is about vaccines, but I just want to say something else. He said, go ahead. She said, and I quote, COVID is fake, and Dr. Fauci knows it. It's easy to be certain. You could tell from her voice that she was certain about this. And I'm certain that she's wrong. It's so easy to be certain, and it is so easy to, at the same time, be wrong. I have a sister-in-law who is anti-vax and anti-mask. I'm pro-vax and mask. Which of us is wrong? I'm certain that I know which of us is wrong, and she is certain that she knows which of us is wrong. So government can't decide which one of us is right. I recently read that the real challenge isn't being right, but knowing that you might be wrong. And eighth, the problem of endless censorship. The censor's job is to censor. History teaches me, at least, that once the censor had censored that thing that he or she went after, then it's the censor's job to censor. You've got to move on to something else. We'll work it down to the least common denominator, the most politically correct denominator. Dennis Miller once said, the last time I can remember an entire nation being on the same page, it was Germany in the 30s, and that didn't turn out to be all that funny. And finally, sometimes censorship backfires. If your goal is to suppress something, sometimes censoring it is exactly the wrong thing to do. I have a friend who was involved in the local, in Omaha, in the local record business, and he told me this story. Two Live Crew came out with this album, Nasty as They Want to Be. And it was offensively nasty. And so the city of Omaha passed an ordinance making it illegal to sell that tape back in the day. My friend, the record store guy, he said, you know, before the city passed that ordinance, record stores were packing up Two Live Crew tapes to send them back. They weren't selling, nobody bought them. The minute they passed that ordinance, they had to get their box cutter out and open all those boxes and put these tapes back on the shelf, and sometimes order new ones. So that city ordinance just totally and completely backfired. I heard a report on the CBC one time, and I don't know, but I love this one. It has to do with the Kingsmen and the song Louie Louie, or Louie Louie. And they were interviewing one of the members of the Kingsmen, and he was on a boat off the coast in California or someplace, and he was fishing, and he was living a life of luxury. And they asked him about that song, and he said, well, you know, we were just a little band. We were an instrumental band, and we wanted to get a job on a cruise ship. So we sent them a tape. And they responded to us and said, well, we want lyrics. So they sent him back a tape of the song, Louie Louie. And he said, but we really didn't know the words. So it was all garbled. They didn't get the job. But there was a radio station in Boston that had this contest every week, which song is worse, this one or this one? And the first time they did Louie Louie, that got voted worst. And so it moved on to the next week, compared with another song. It kept losing, so it kept getting played. And so suddenly people started requesting it. And he said some college student went home to Boston and played the record, and his father heard it, and his father was a person of influence. So his father got the city together to ban Louie Louie. And the interviewer interrupted and said, success at last. And he said, yes, suddenly every kid in every college in the country wanted a copy of Louie Louie. He said, that's how I can afford to live on this boat off the coast of California. So there's one more question, but I can't address it today. It's a subject for another talk. One more question. Well, then what can we do about offensive speech? And there are things that we can do about offensive speech. But what can't be done is government criminalizing it just because it offends. And as Mr. Bennett said, we said we're saving the best for last. I'm the last of the last. So thank you, and you're free to go.
I wish we had time for questions. I think we have time for questions, but we just don't have any time for answers. So those of you who do have questions, please go up and talk to our panelists after this meeting. We are at the end of this conference. I want to thank you all for coming today and yesterday, and for all the work that has gone into these wonderful presentations. Would you please give all of our presenters another hand of applause for remarkable addresses. Again, we'd like to thank Conference Technologies. I think that the medium is the message. And I think that's been one of the great messages of this conference, that you've done such a great work, you and your team. Let's give them a hand. And to all those who have helped us to make this conference a success, thank you very much. We will be, those of you who would like to join us for a short little tour of the Kanesville Log Tabernacle, or at least the site, we will be driving down there. My wife and I, you can follow us in just 5 minutes in our van down to the Kanesville Log Tabernacle for just a few-minute tour of that area, and then we're going to go out to the Winter Quarters Mormon Trail Center for a tour of that place starting at 6:45. And then tonight, there will be a dinner for all speakers and panelists, and especially invited if you have your little voucher for that. That dinner will start at 7:30 p.m. So again, thank you all. This has been recorded. We will be getting, hopefully, permission from the speakers to have this published and be available. See you again.